distinguished guests, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for joining us for this special event, US election outcomes and implications in an era of uncertainty. My name is Ahmad Dallal and I am the Dean of Georgetown University in Qatar and the moderator for today's event. Every 4 years, Georgetown University in Qatar hosts a series of events around the US presidential election. Because of the election's significant impact, both on American foreign policy and indeed on the world for the coming 4 years and beyond. This election is perhaps America's most consequential in decades. The two candidates clearly have different visions for the United States. Additionally, to say that this election has an impact on all of the key issues of our time is an understatement. The results of the election will have a direct impact on the shape of the global economy, the fate of democracies throughout the world, the outcomes of global conflicts, and some would argue the future of a liberal world order. Whether we are talking about the environment, immigration, poverty, or international relations, the 2020 election will influence the global trajectory for the next 4 years and beyond. To provide analysis on how the election outcome will affect these issues and better understand the context of this moment in history, today's event draws together 4 experts on American history and government. Now, to provide maximum amount of time for discussion at the end, I will briefly introduce our panelists in speaking order. The first speaker is Dr. Clyde Wilcox, who's a professor in government in the government department at Georgetown University, where he has taught since 1987. He is a specialist in American and comparative politics and has authored or edited more than 30 books and hundreds of articles and book chapters. Today, he will be giving us some insight into democratic norms and the rule of law and how they affect and are impacted by the election. The second speaker is Dr. Garrett, who's an assistant professor of political science at Georgetown University in Qatar. She is a specialist in comparative and international politics with a focus on the implications of migration and ethnic diversity in advanced democracies. She has written a number of articles which examine the domestic consequences of international immigration and integration, and the political incorporation of minorities, amongst other topics. Today, she will be talking about the impact of the election on migration policy. The third speaker is Dr. Trish Kahle, who's an assistant professor of history, specializing in the history of energy, work, and politics in the modern United States and the world. She has authored several journal articles, and her work has been supported by the Mellon Foundation, the Jefferson Scholars Foundation, and the American Society for Environmental History, amongst others. The topics she will address today include the environmental outcomes of the election. And last but not least, we have Dr. Anatol Lieven, professor of government. His wide areas of expertise include, in addition to many other areas, US and Western strategy, the countries of the former Soviet Union, and the Greater Middle East. He is author of a number of books and journal articles, including America, Right or Wrong, An Anatomy of American Nationalism, and has briefed US Congress and British Parliament numerous times in the areas of his expertise. Today, he will be briefing us on the election effects, on how the election affects the US Constitution, the future of America, and global politics. Thank you, Anatol, Trish, Amanda, and Clyde for weighing in on the election and sharing your analysis with us today. I know I will be avidly watching the election coverage. I think we will all be more informed as to what is at stake. The format for discussion will be for each panelist to present on their chosen topic for 5 minutes, followed by a moderated discussion, and then, which I will moderate, and then we will open the discussion to questions from the audience. I will be helped in moderating the question from the audience by my colleague, Rita Roche. So thank you again for being with us tonight. And now, to get things started, Clyde Wilcox will discuss democratic norms and the rule of law. Clyde, please.
Sorry. So in October of 2000, I was in Kampala, Uganda, lecturing for the State Department to a group of young legislators And they asked me what they should do if President Museveni retired, as the Constitution said he should, and they had a very close election. And I said they needed to take all the time that they needed to count the votes, count them carefully, make sure they knew who won. The very next month was November of 2000, where we did not do that, where Bush and Gore sued each other until we ran out of time to fully count the votes. In March of 2001, I met with a group of young African leaders, and one of those leaders was from the Ugandan group. And he said, "Didn't you say you should count all the votes carefully?" And I said, this was not our proudest moment. But the good news is that after 220 years, the rule of law is so deeply ensconced in America that Al Gore was confident he had won the election, but he packed his bags and left. Now it appears I may have spoken a little bit too soon. Donald Trump is the first presidential candidate, first incumbent president, not to agree to accept the outcome of an election. He has in fact refused to do this for the entire campaign. He has invited armed militia to show up at the polls to make sure the voting goes correctly. These are private militia. He has appointed a political hack to head the post office who has sabotaged the mail service in the United States, resulting in the delay of tens of thousands of mail-in ballots that will probably not be mailed in on time. He has a massive team of lawyers hoping to challenge the counting of ballots, hoping to throw out hundreds of thousands, if not millions of ballots in many of the key states, especially in Pennsylvania. There's a case going forward right now to the federal courts where Republicans are seeking to throw out 105,000 ballots that have already been cast in Houston, Texas. He hopes to either throw out those ballots or tie up the election in court so long that we can't really get the counting done. And then there is some doubt as to the outcome. And then maybe the state legislators in those states will simply send his electors instead. He has repeatedly asked the Attorney General to arrest his opponent. In fact, just this week, there were angry crowds outside Bill Barr's house shouting, "Lock him up, lock him up." He's backed a bunch of bizarre theories about conspiracies that even Fox News will not back. And he's told his supporters the only way he can lose is if there's massive fraud. And he told the violent white nationalist group, the Proud Boys, to stand down, but to stand by. So the thing to understand, though, is Trump is unique in disregarding the rule of law, but the Republicans more broadly have been trying to suppress the vote for years. In 2018 in Georgia, the Secretary of State was running for the governor, and the Secretary of State is in charge of maintaining the voter rolls. He purged hundreds of thousands of names from the rolls, tens of thousands. And in Wisconsin, the same thing happened in 2016. In Texas this year, the Republican governor has said there's only one drop-off station for every county in the state. Now, the largest county in Texas is about half again the size of Qatar. That is 1.5 times the size of the entire country of Qatar. Think about how long it would take to drive across the country. And the most populous county has more than 5 million residents. Imagine what that line would be. The logic of all this is they think the Democrats are more afraid of the virus and so therefore will not vote in person. And so they're trying to force them in the midst of a pandemic to vote in person. Why is this happening? Well, because Republicans have not won the popular vote since 2004. And before that, the last time they won the popular vote was 1988. So they don't really think they can win the popular vote. They think the only way they can win is by tossing out votes. The 53 Republican senators who constitute the majority represent 44% of Americans. So this is a minority party that seeks to hold on to power by limiting voting rights.
Thank you, Clyde. Of course, we will have a chance to ask additional questions. Now, Amanda Garrett will be talking about the impact of the election on immigration policy. Professor Garrett, please.
Terrific. Thank you, Dean Dallal. So a lot of us probably remember very clearly the 2016 elections just 4 years ago. And for those of us who were paying attention, we remember very vividly also that immigration and migration were very central to that campaign. This is particularly true of the Trump campaign. In fact, immigration basically became Trump's brand even before he had sort of accepted the Republican nomination. As the campaign went on, Trump begins to outline his immigration plan and his objectives. So, he's going to stop funding for sanctuary cities. He's going to end DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. This is the sort of Obama era program. He's going to end catch and release. He's going to increase deportation of undocumented migrants. And of course, he's going to build a wall that Mexico is going to pay for. And so immigration became very central to that 2016 election campaign. Now, fast forward to today, so we're less than 24 hours before the polls are going to close in the 2020 election. And hopefully you've noticed, or one thing you should have noticed, is that immigration has been really absent from this election cycle, from this campaign. We haven't really seen the candidates talk about immigration in the presidential debates or the vice presidential debates. We didn't see it in the town hall, the parallel town hall that the candidates had. A Wall Street Journal report that was issued just recently of sort of all the election issues that were talked about over the campaign cycle in the media and the news and the ads found that immigration was actually the least mentioned of all the campaign issues. So it's a footnote in this campaign, which is a stark difference from what we remember from 2016. And I think this begs a couple of questions. The obvious one is, why has immigration policy faded sort of from this 2020 electoral campaign? And the answer is simply that it isn't, the incentive really isn't there anymore to talk about it for the candidates. And this is particularly true of the Trump side of the campaign. He's got his avid support base, and for them, his immigration track record is largely viewed as a success, right? He's in his administration, in his term of office, he's implemented more than 400 executive actions on immigration alone. The Muslim ban, closing the southern border, mass deportations, and of course, building the wall. And so for them, it's sort of a given that they'll have more of the same should he be elected. There are also policies of Donald Trump's that have actually turned out to be political vulnerabilities for him. The child separation policy, for example, at the border, when this was implemented, or when this was put into practice, it sparked massive outrage amongst the public. It was deeply unpopular. And so there are policies like this that the Trump campaign is probably not terribly anxious to revisit or to welcome back into the campaign discussions. And then, of course, Trump has a more sort of extreme anti-immigrant voter base, and amongst them, actually, there is a lot of frustration over the lack of immigration reform that Trump has undertaken. So one of the sort of more hardcore anti-immigrant institutions or organizations called Numbers USA, ranks policies and ranks elected officials on immigration policy. And Trump has actually been rated as fairly unsuccessful because, as it turns out, you don't get any points for calling Mexicans criminals. You get points for closing down refugee camps or for implementing a skills-based migration system, which Trump has not been able to do. And of course, people's minds are elsewhere, right? They're interested now in other things: COVID response, healthcare, racial justice, the economy. And so there are other things that are really occupying the voters' attention at the moment. But just because the campaign isn't talking about immigration, I don't think we can, we have a lack of information to basically say what these candidates are likely to do should they get into office. So if in the next few days the election is called for Trump, you can pretty much expect the same, right? You can expect more restrictions, you can expect more executive actions, more crackdowns, more deportations. You can expect basically the trajectory to continue along the same path. For Biden, I'm not sure that that we have as much clarity on what that would look like. What we do know is that Biden is going to inherit a mess. He's going to inherit hundreds of policies and executive actions that he has to somehow unravel. So he'll have to take stock of what's been done and try to right some of the wrongs that have happened in the last 4 years. That's going to be more difficult for Biden to do if the Democrats do not win the Senate. Not impossible, just more difficult. But what we do know is that, those first 100 days for Biden are going to be really critical. And that's a chance for the new administration to send a message that, that's a new day in America, similar to what Trump did when he took office. What we do know is that Biden has promised to freeze deportations for 100 days. He's promised to roll back some of the zero tolerance policies, the detention programs, the migration protection protocol, the MPP, which essentially is the policy that's kept asylum seekers out of the United States. And he's promised to reinstate temporary protective status for some groups of asylum seekers. But whatever happens in the next 24 hours to 10 days, whenever the election is called, I think it's very clear that that immigrants are going to be affected. Their lives are going to be affected in a very significant way, for better, for worse.
Thank you, Amanda. Now, Trish Kahle will address today the environmental outcomes of the election. Professor Kahle, please.
Thank you so much. So yes, I want to turn our attention now to the environmental crisis and the stakes for this election, which I think we all know could not be higher. We are quickly running out of time to address the climate crisis in a way that will mitigate the worst impacts for the most vulnerable, both in the United States, but also around the world. I also think it's important to recognize that even a mitigated crisis will still be a crisis that the world will struggle to cope with. It calls into question basic norms of political and economic life that many of us have taken for granted. But I think, strikingly, that's not as contentious of a statement as it might have once been. And if that's in part because of the pandemic and then 4 years of the Trump administration, it's also because the crisis is unfolding before us every day, and the inequalities that it drives becoming more clear. The COVID-19 pandemic has been in part a test run for the climate crisis. And if we view it that way, we should be profoundly concerned about the future for the United States, from the polarization of public health science to White House-led discrediting of institutions like the CDC and the FDA, the lag times and inadequacy of funding for relief programs, the weakness of the nation's social and care infrastructures. If the US has failed miserably at containing the pandemic, it is certainly unprepared for the challenges of the climate crisis. But notably, these are not simply mirror-style catastrophes, but they're actually experienced together. They both require long-range planning and commitments, and they often have remedies that would be mutually supporting. The connection between the two was really powerfully visualized for me earlier this year in California, where a senior center sign reminding people to wear a mask, maintain distance, and wash their hands was engulfed in flames as record-breaking wildfires, exacerbated by climate change, swept across the West. US residents facing repeated hurricanes in Louisiana were forced to weigh the risk of contracting COVID if they evacuated, with the risks of trying to ride out the storm at home if they could even afford to leave at all. And so this is really a couple of examples of how, for many Americans, the experience of the pandemic has been an experience of climate crisis as they've approached the election. And so faced with this situation, we have two candidates with climate plans that outline very different visions for the nation's future. And I think Trump's really just looks a lot like if herd immunity were sort of rebranded as a climate plan. It accepts an acceleration of the crisis by continuing to subsidize fossil fuel development, to open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil drilling, to keep rolling back regulations on air and water pollution, toxic waste, and wildlife protections. And these are impacts that will not be felt evenly, but will be disproportionately borne by Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. And equally important, I think, building on the previous contribution, right, that this is also seen along the southern border, that this is really his approach to climate refugee policy, because some of this migration is being driven by droughts in places like Guatemala. Notably, this plan also feeds the eco-fascist strain of thought in the US far right and strengthens his ties with other authoritarian leaders, notably Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro. Now, Biden, on the other hand, has a plan with a very different vision for the future of climate politics. It's the most extensive plan ever put forward by a mainstream presidential candidate, and yet it still falls far short of the bold vision that is actually needed. And his repeated claims to not ban fracking or declining to support the Green New Deal both evoke to me the Obama administration, which yes, did sign the Paris Climate Accords, but also supported a massive gas and oil boom in the United States that has exacerbated the crisis. It also falls quite short on the climate and environmental impacts of the military, where Biden falls pretty squarely into the mainstream of US imperial politics. And I think to end, I just want to lay out a couple of issues that I think even if Biden were elected into office are key urgent tasks that need addressing. First is addressing the issue of environmental justice as it relates to the development of nuclear power, which has not been adequately addressed in his plan. Again, addressing the US military presence and bases around the world. Issues related to resource development that come with expanding electric car infrastructure, particularly lithium, which is a global environmental justice issue. And then creating a path toward carbon neutrality that is not easily dismantled by a future administration that allows for some real long-term planning. And so, at the end of the day, they're asking us to really consider what kind of country the United States will be. But it's also a question of not just a candidate, but broader political culture, which has been seriously eroded in the past 4 years. So the challenges are quite big.
Thank you, Trish. Anatol Lieven will be briefing us on how the election affects the US Constitution, the future of America, and global politics. Professor Lieven, please.
Sorry, unmute myself. Yeah, I'm afraid to some extent I'm going to talk about how the election will not affect the US Constitution. The problem is that the US Constitution is very difficult to affect. Now, when I was living in Washington previously, you were simply not allowed to talk at mainstream think tanks, newspapers, elsewhere, about the flaws of the Constitution. The general response was the Constitution cannot be discussed. Now, of course, it is being widely discussed, but as we are discovering, under the terms of the Constitution itself, it is very, very difficult to change. The kind of majorities you need, first in the Senate, then among the states, make it impossible in a highly polarized political system to bring about these changes. Now, it could be that things will change to a degree as a result of these elections. But that raises two questions, which we will see answered, of course. The first is if people will come to recognize the real risk of constitutional breakdown. Clyde has alluded to African examples. In other words, of the US joining, well, Ivory Coast at the moment, as one of these places where the election results are routinely contested by the losing party, relying on the flaws of the electoral system itself to lend their charges credibility. It's important to note that so many of the problems that Clyde alluded to are enabled by the US Constitution. The United States is, to the best of my knowledge, unique among developed democracies in not having a national election commission. This is part of the whole business of states' rights in America. In this case, the right of the states to set their own election rules to, well, actually for the House of Representatives, to delineate constituency borders and so forth and so on. But as I've said, these things cannot be constitutionally changed. Now, if, God forbid, we see a constitutional breakdown in the next few weeks, then hopefully out of that will come a national consensus that something does have to be changed, because otherwise the United States is likely to face such breakdowns again and again. Even if America dodges a bullet this time, it's unlikely to do so forever, given the terms of the US Constitution. And then, of course, the fact that if you have a real legal contestation, it ends up in the Supreme Court, which is now a completely politically polarized body with a built-in Republican majority. So obviously the first question is whether we can get through this election without a constitutional breakdown, leading hopefully to constitutional reform. The second question, though, is if the Democrats win, and as I think Amanda said, the question is also, do they win the Senate? If they don't win the Senate, then they are to a great extent crippled, as Obama was in his second term. If they can win the Senate, then there are a number of smaller things that they can do, but which nonetheless, would have a significant effect. They can try to force certain procedural changes in the elections, and basically dare the Supreme, to enforce things at a national level and dare the Supreme Court to vote them down. They can, of course, this has been now widely discussed, pack the Supreme Court with Democratic nominees. Now, if they do that, of course, they are pointing towards ultimately the Supreme Court itself having to be reformed, because if they pack it with theirs, the Republicans will undoubtedly pack it with theirs when they come in, and eventually you'll get an absurdity. There is no limit at that point to the number of Supreme Court judges you might have. My own hope is that a proposal will be adopted that you should move towards, in a way, a kind of consociational solution to this, and the Democrats and the Republicans should both have the right to nominate equal numbers of Supreme Court justices, who will then be vetted by a non-partisan committee of the judiciary. Whether something like that is still possible in America, I don't know. And then, of course, there is the question of the composition of the Senate. You cannot change the one state, two senators rule, but of course it has been proposed very strongly that there should be a real movement to give statehood to Washington, DC, and possibly to Puerto Rico, which would change the balance in the Senate. If none of this is possible, then we may see eventually a mass movement for constitutional reform, a new civil rights movement, if you will, given that the present system, to a degree, disenfranchises so many Americans, de facto, if not de jure, which is of course illegal in America. The problem about that is that the present constitution, of course, does not just favor the Republican Party, it favors whites, and especially, of course, white conservatives, but yeah, well, whites. And a movement for its reform, therefore, is likely or liable to become highly racialized with dangerous consequences for American unity and public order, as well, of course, as the fact that it is, once you start a mass movement of that kind, it is very difficult to prevent it becoming violent and possibly leading to a backlash against it. So that is, that raises the question of just how radical a Biden administration is prepared to be when it comes to changing the American system. Moving on to foreign policy and following what Trish Kahle said, climate change is the biggest issue where the Biden administration could make a real difference. Immigration as well, insofar as that is a foreign policy issue. On everything else, I think we will not see much change, frankly. Biden is very much a product of the establishment, the blob as it's been called. But also Trump has, in practice, as opposed to blustering rhetoric, done far less actually to change things than his rhetoric would suggest in foreign policy. On China, the biggest issue by far, apart from climate change, the two parties are at one, the Democrats and the Republicans, on the need to confront China. There is one big difference, however, potentially, which affects this part of the world, and that is the question of the return to the nuclear deal with Iran, achieved by the Obama administration. Now, which of course has tremendous implications also for the position of Qatar, if that is passed, and for American relations with Saudi Arabia. Now, Biden has promised to return to the deal, but on the other hand, you have had some statements from his camp saying that they will try to renegotiate the deal. Well, the Iranians have made absolutely clear that that is not acceptable, that you must go back to the full deal or nothing. And the Iranians, by the way, have taken certain actions to try to nail in place the changes that they have introduced, which they feel were completely legitimate, since it was, after all, America that walked away from the nuclear deal. So on this too, we will have to see just how radical a Biden administration is prepared to be. But on everything else, of course, the atmospherics will be better. The atmospherics of relations with Europe will be much better. But I wonder how much real change we will see in US foreign and security policy, which is, after all, in the end, the product not of one man, but of the American establishment.
Thank you, Anatol. Thank you all for your insightful remarks. I would now like to ask a few questions to get the discussion started, and then after a round or two of questions, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So please, I know there are already a couple of questions on the Q&A and at least one hand raised. Please bear with us, and we'll come back shortly to your questions. Let me start with Clyde. Clyde, in recent months, many observers have noted the gap between policy and practice when it comes to democracy and the rule of law. So the question is, how are democratic institutions defined by norms? And why is something as important as the framework of an entire government left to rely on shared expectations rather than specific laws?
So as Anatol has said, we are governed by a constitution, and what he's not said is it's 237 years old. And so it's very brief. In fact, every state has a constitution that is much larger. And so the only way you can make a 9 or 10 page constitution actually work is both with some laws, but also with some norms, right? And the norm that we will accept the outcome of an election is a pretty important norm, right? The outcome, the idea that everyone should be allowed to vote is an important norm, because we do allow the states to administer elections. And so, as an example, the state of Florida in 2018 had a referendum to allow ex-felons to vote in elections. It was overwhelmingly passed. That is to say, the voters overwhelmingly wanted ex-felons, people who have served their time and are now out in the community, to be allowed to vote. But the Republican legislature immediately then passed a law that every fine that they possibly owed had to be paid before they were allowed to vote. Now, the norm should really be, well, the people have spoken here, right? But when norms begin to break down, then it's really hard for consensus to happen. So Anatol mentioned packing the court. That's what the Republicans have actually done. They refused to confirm a justice that was nominated by Barack Obama, a very moderate justice. They refused to confirm hundreds of federal court justices. And then for the last 4 years, they have been pushing people through so quickly. They were an hour away from voting on a guy who didn't really have a law degree. He had faked his CV. So they're already packing the court. That breaks the norm, right? So the real question for me is, could someone like Biden, who people have referred to as a Mr. Rogers type of president, come in a way and try to reestablish some of the norms, meet with some of the Republicans, meet with some of the Democrats, and try to say, look, these are values we should all accept. But having a really small constitution, having a very decentralized political system, norms have become very important.
Thank you, Clyde. Dr. Garrett, how concerned are Americans about immigration policy? And is it a big driver to get people to the polls?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very fair to say that there have in fact been some very significant changes in terms of America's feelings about immigration over the last 4 years. and that this is actually translated into the way that they're going to vote, or the way at least that they think about casting their vote. So it's important to remember, America's society is a pretty divided society, and this is not new, right? You've got sort of one side of American society that's more supportive, more tolerant of demographic change, of cultural shift. And historically, this lines up much more closely with the democratic persuasion. And on the other side, you have a segment of the population that is less supportive, if not outright rejects the notion of democratic change and cultural shifts. And so that's largely the Republican support base. Now, I think what you've seen over the last 4 years with Trump is that the rhetoric, right, the discussion, the rhetoric surrounding immigration has become more extreme, has become more explicit, has become more polarized, and this has had an effect of sort of crystallizing these two societies, or these two American societies, in a different way, and affects the way that voters are going to think about their vote. And in some respects, the casting of a vote for the Democrats or the Republicans is either choosing to accept that extremism or to reject it in a way. But there have been some sort of interesting changes in public opinion, I would say, about immigration over the last 4 years, namely that there seems to be, at least if the polls are to be believed, this seems to be actually an increase in positive perceptions of immigration. So Gallup runs a poll, a sort of an ongoing poll over the last couple of years, and recently their 2020 data indicates that 77% of Americans have a positive, or express a sort of a positive view of immigration. They think immigration is a good thing. And that's actually the highest that number has been since Gallup started asking this question in 2001. Similar polls that are done by Pew indicate pretty much the same thing, that about 60% of Americans believe that immigrants have strengthened American society. Now, of course, there is a partisan divide here, right? The Democrats are much more likely to indicate that they are supportive of immigration than those who identify themselves as Republicans. But even amongst the Republicans, over the last 4 years, there has been an increase in thinking positively about immigration. So in 2016, only 19% of those who identified as Republicans felt immigrants strengthened American society. And that number is 32% in the 2020 data. So there's been a slight increase in sort of positive perceptions of immigrants in the United States. But even though voters may be thinking more positively about immigration, I think it still is the case that in terms of the election, in terms of voting, immigration is not as important an issue as it was in 2016. Again, the polls that are coming out of, the studies that are coming out of the Pew Research Center indicate that basically only 50% of Americans today indicate that immigration is an important policy issue for them in their vote in 2020, and that's down from 70% in 2016. If you ask them to sort of rank their policy preferences, immigration's close to the bottom, right? It's ranked sort of 9th after, again, COVID policy and healthcare, and the economy and social justice in the Supreme Court. And so it's clear that immigration has lost a lot of its salience, especially with those voters in the middle, or especially with some of the swing voters that the candidates are going to need to attract in order to win.
Thank you, Ahmad. Dr. Kahle, what are the long-term effects of current U.S. environmental policies in terms of environmental outcomes and foreign policy signaling?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I think there are a few different threads which we can pull out. One are the sort of the political impacts, one which are the actual environmental impacts, and then the sort of shifting dynamics of international power. So I think on the first, the Trump administration's approach to environmental policy has seriously weakened the regulatory structures in the US government, particularly places where oversight is a really critical component of maintaining infrastructure, whether that's pipelines or other sort of Superfund sites and other kinds of installations. And what that means is that there are less chances to catch problems before they accelerate, right? And so I think one of the longer term impacts of that will be an uptick in disasters, right? Things like dam collapses, things like pipeline failures, simply because the regulatory structure that was sort of set up to oversee those things has been undermined and underfunded, just not filling positions at the Department of the Interior. Again, not so much making active changes as simply failing to fill positions or rolling back previously stated regulations. Then I think, and again, sort of emphasizing that there are some strong points of continuity from previous administrations. I think one of the longer term environmental impacts will be the methane emissions from fracking, which, we only really have some data on it. We need more data on exactly how much is being emitted from even abandoned wells. But this is a huge issue. It's an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. And then finally, I think on the sort of question of environmental justice is that we have lost some really important time, particularly with oil and coal workers, to implement just transition policies. Just in the last few months, there has been over 100,000 layoffs in the oil industry alone. And rather than having sort of a structured phase out of these industries, what we've had instead is sort of chaos for the people who are working within them. And so that's all happening on the domestic front. And I think we've already seen some of the long-term retreat of the US from international leadership on environmental issues. And I think China has really clearly already stepped in on this point, right? Trying to declare carbon neutrality by 2050. Japan and South Korea followed. And it's hard to see how the US gets that kind of leadership back on any kind of timeline that allows for real international leadership on the climate crisis.
Thank you. Dr. Lieven, President Trump's detractors would say that an often contradictory foreign policy driven by narrow local interests and ambitions has compromised America's international standing. His supporters, on the other hand, would argue that he succeeded in centering US interests domestically and abroad, and used the non-politician's courage to confront failing policies. So, if we can ask this question, where does the truth lie? And what changes can we expect to see in the global order under either 4 more years of Trump or through the course reversal of the Biden administration?
I mean, as far as Trump's rhetoric and policies are concerned, there's a famous Texan saying, "All hat and no cattle." The rhetoric, the bluster has been far, far in advance of what he's actually done. Now, that, however, is for good as well as for bad. If he'd actually followed through with his language on North Korea at one stage and on Iran, we'd be in 2 wars by now. But actually, Trump is not in practice a bellicose president and has backed away from that, if only because he's quite capable of reading US public opinion polls, which are strongly hostile to more wars. Trump's rhetoric has, however, and Trump's personality, his entire behavior, have done tremendous damage to America's standing, to America's soft power image, prestige in the world, and that of American democracy. As for his policies, once again, he has not in practice changed that much from previous administrations, except once again in the area of climate change, where of course the change from Obama was very significant, and policy towards Iran. Now, Trump has of course made America a lot closer to Saudi Arabia than it was under Obama, but then, America has remained allied to Saudi Arabia for generations now. And now that Israel is also allied to Saudi Arabia, that locks in place an American policy in this regard. And as I said previously, I mean, on China, the parties are united in effect. But there is one interesting area where Biden might introduce a difference, and that is linked once again to climate change, because there have been strong suggestions that if America is to really pursue moves to limit carbon emissions at home, then it should link American trade policy and tariffs to this as well. In other words, countries around the world which do not themselves live up to their commitments under the Paris Agreement would be punished by American sanctions and American tariffs. So that is one way, I think, where one might see a tough American foreign policy coming together with environmental policy. The problem there is, of course, however, that if consistently followed through, that would also require America to be very tough on some of its friends and allies. And we have to see whether any American administration will be, really prepared to do that one. If I might just refer to, the link of foreign policy to environmental policy at home, an absolutely critical issue will be whether a Biden administration is prepared to raise the money for serious infrastructure development, or to bring in measures which would really encourage private capital to go into infrastructure investment. Because I think that in future, America's capacity simply to borrow money to spend on this will be more limited. I mean, especially since there will be, obviously real constraints on borrowing money from China. That means higher taxes. And so far, the indications from the Biden team on that have been, alas, very mixed. They've said that they will reverse some of Trump's tax cuts, but really only for the very wealthy and only to a limited extent. Half of the, for example, corporate tax cuts introduced by Trump will apparently remain in place. You are not going to be able to raise the necessary money for the changes that are essential if America is to move, towards zero carbon by 2050, as Biden has now said that he wants.
Thank you, Anatol. Professor Wilcox, in the case of a contested or inconclusive election, what legal means are in place to ensure a smooth transition of power? And in your view, what is the worst case scenario? And is it a likely one?
Okay, so the worst case scenario is Trump simply refused to leave, right? He loses, he insists on staying in office. Someone has to pick him up and carry him out of the building. But so the worst case scenario is that we're in court for almost all the time until the president has to be sworn in. The one constitutional constant is the day the president is sworn in. We have to have a winner by then. But what happened in Florida in 2000 was that the two sides sued each other, and the Bush team sought to block the recount so they couldn't count the votes. And eventually they ran out of time, and they said, well, we can't count them. We have to go with what we have. Trump has his attorneys trying to do that in Pennsylvania. He's hoping to throw out all of the mailed-in ballots there. And then he's hoping that if we have no winner, either because it's an electoral college tie, which is a slight possibility, or because some states can't report their results, then it would go to the House of Representatives. And it's not a vote of the House per se, it's a vote of state delegations in the House, so that each state gets one vote. So Wyoming with 470,000 people gets one vote, and California with 38 million people gets one vote. As Anatol says, favoring these big empty white states with lots of cows. So worst case scenario is a pretty bad scenario, right? We're throwing out ballots everywhere. There's anger. Trump is saying there's massive fraud. His militia are starting to become violent. The Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys are out there with their guns. I don't think that's going to happen, though. I actually think that many of the Republican judges are going to understand the importance of this election and are going to insist on a really quick resolution. In Texas, where they're trying to throw out 105,000 ballots, in Houston, a series of Republican judges have said no to that. And so I'm cautiously optimistic, first of all, that there's a big Biden wave and it won't be close enough for him to do it. But secondly, that in the end, the need for a successful conclusion to the election will mean that the judges do not vote the way that Trump hopes they will.
Thank you, Clyde. Professor Garrett, President Trump has made substantial cuts to both illegal and legal immigration into the United States. Would a Trump win result in an escalation of these anti-immigrant policies? In addition, how likely is Biden to reverse these policies in light of the strong public support of an immigration freeze, in part due to the ongoing pandemic?
Right. So you're right. So since Trump has taken office, actually annual net migration to the United States has fallen by about 50%. About 600,000 people a year coming into the United States. And that's a number that is extremely low, right? We haven't seen that number since pretty much the 1980s. And it really all has to do with Trump's restrictive immigration policies, which have been exacerbated by COVID. Basically, you have, the Muslim travel ban, right, which has been now extended to include other countries besides just the original 6. You have an asylum system that basically doesn't exist anymore in the United States. You have a decrease in illegal migrants coming in through the green card ban and through the restrictions on H-1B or high-skilled work visas. So you have incredibly restrictive policies under Trump that have decreased both legal and illegal migration significantly. And, if Trump wins the election, what you're going to see is pretty much more of the same. His policy advisor, Stephen Miller, who is responsible essentially for drafting and for creating and spearheading these policies, has pretty much said that he has similar, if not more restrictive policies on the back burner, ready to be sort of ushered out. I think the two of the potential policies that we have the most to worry about would be an attempt to end DACA again, right? So this is again the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which would give some sort of temporary legal amnesty for undocumented migrants who came as children. And Trump tried to put an end to it already, right? And it was blocked by the Supreme Court, but it was blocked on procedural grounds. So if Trump tries again and he does it the right way, he follows the correct protocol, the chances of him being able to sort of repeal that are very high. And then Stephen Miller has also floated the idea of ending birthright citizenship in the United States. So the United States has one of the most unrestricted jus soli birthright citizenship regimes in the world. Being born on U.S. soil and entitles you in some way to access potentially U.S. citizenship. So to do away with that would be a huge blow, I think, to our notion of membership and immigration and belonging in the United States. Now, if Biden wins the election, I think you will absolutely see an attempt to systematically reverse a lot of what Trump has done. Now, luckily maybe, a lot of what Trump has done falls into the category of either an executive order, executive action, or a sort of a federal regulation. So these aren't laws that have gone through Congress, which would be much more difficult to overturn. And it's a matter of tradition almost that an incoming president reviews the executive orders of a previous administration and overturns them or reverses them with sort of the stroke of a pen. So it's relatively easy. To undo a regulation is a little bit more difficult, but it's not impossible. And so I think, with some political will, there's the potential for a Biden administration to undo a lot of this, these sort of Trump executive orders. So the travel ban, for example, or the sort of Muslim ban, the travel ban. Biden could increase ceilings for asylum seekers to allow larger numbers of asylum seekers to claim in the United States. He could end the Remain in Mexico program, or the MPP, again, which has basically prevented asylum seekers from claiming asylum in the United States. He could stop construction on the wall. And he could even, direct ICE to stop arresting and stop detaining undocumented migrants. So all of these things are sort of within the playbook of possibility. I do, however, think that Biden is going to face a lot of hurdles to doing this. Logistical hurdles, certainly, because again, there is a lot to undo. You can't just walk into the White House and sort of refuse to implement the policies and the laws that are there. You have to unravel them and undo them with, following the proper sort of protocols. And he could face legal challenges to doing that. And my colleagues have already mentioned sort of packing the courts. The GOP has put a lot of very conservative judges in federal in federal courts, and so there could be legal challenges to what any Biden administration tries to do, and he's going to face a lot of political pressure, right, to make some changes. If you think specifically about sort of the southern border, which for all intents and purposes right now is basically closed. Biden has repeatedly said that he wants to undo the MPP, he wants to open up the border, and there are potential political consequences to doing that. If you open the border too quickly, right, or without unraveling the policies in a more systematic manner, you run the risk of essentially waves of asylum seekers or waves of migrants showing up at the border, these sort of caravans that Trump had used to stoke fears earlier on in the election. So, and that's not a good look for the president, even a Democratic one. And so he has to be careful about how he unravels some of the policies. So, at the end of the day, I think because of the way that the Trump administration laid out these policies, the legacy of immigration policy is going to outlast him, right, in a very significant way.